Our next speaker is Amanda Yee. Amanda Yee is an organizer and writer based in Brooklyn. She's the editor of Liberation News, and her writings have appeared in Monthly Review Online, as well as in the Real News Network and Black Agenda Report. And Amanda also she's the host of a podcast called Radio Free Amanda. So please go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I want to congratulate Carlos for publishing this book, and also extend my gratitude to all the organizers of this event and including me on this very impressive panel. So in this period of US hostility against China, this is a really important book that provides a critical understanding of China's socialist system. And as Carlos discussed in his opening remarks, it thoroughly disproves this idea that this new Cold War is what some may refer to as an inter-imperialist rivalry, a concept which I believe is not only a misunderstanding of how US policymakers reorganized the world following World War II, but also disarms the anti-war movement politically, in that it obfuscates the role of the true aggressor, which is and always has been the US. I wanted to speak specifically to the last chapter, oppose the new Cold War on China, and talk a bit more about the context and particularities to what this new Cold War looks like in the United States, where I'm located, and the political mechanisms that are being used to advance it. As Carlos points out in this chapter, there are similar strategies applied between this new Cold War on China and the previous Cold War against the Soviet Union. And these are tactics that they hope will achieve the counter-revolutionary overthrow of the CPC. Just as it did to the Soviet Union, the US is applying the same policy of containment against China, which involves military pressure and encirclement, subjecting it to bans and boycotts, cutting it off from key technologies to thwart its modernization, while also fueling contradictions within, which the US hopes will lead to balkanization. And that's the idea behind this containment strategy, then as now, is that this constant external pressure applied by the US, in their eyes, would then heighten the internal contradictions, magnify internal problems such that they boil over and China would just collapse from within. And just like the previous Cold War, this new Cold War carries with it its own kind of Red Scare paranoia, where any opponent of this heightened aggression is subject to McCarthyite smears of being a foreign agent or a spy. And I wanted to read a quote from Senator Joseph McCarthy's speech from 1950. This is referred to as his Loss of China speech. And this is what really launched that era of McCarthyism. So he said, "One thing to remember in discussing the communists in our government is that we are not dealing with spies who get 30 pieces of silver to steal the blueprints of new weapons. We are dealing with a far more sinister type of activity because it permits the enemy to guide and shape our policy." This quote is really, it's really interesting and telling to me because this is the same logic that's underlying this current Red Scare that we're in now, that there are shadowy actors within society who are taking orders from the Chinese government to direct policy or public opinion in its favor. Today, the critical foot soldiers in this new Cold War include these DC policy think tanks who repackage the same kind of McCarthyite paranoia. And what they say is strikingly similar to what McCarthy said in his speech. For example, a 2022 report by the Council on Foreign Relations accused China of running what it calls a global influence campaign, in which it was not only trying to shape US policy and certain to meddle in the then upcoming 2022 midterm elections, but it was also continuing, and this is a quote, but it was also continuing a pattern of influence operations it began earlier this century in the Pacific Rim, seeking to shift narratives in its favor and promote pro-Beijing politicians, or sometimes just sow chaos and falsehoods. So it's very similar to what McCarthy was saying in his speech in 1950 about, actors trying to shift policy and public opinion in favor of China. But I also think to really understand this new Cold War and new era of McCarthyism, we have to really study and understand its political weapon of choice, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA for short. So what FARA is, it's a public disclosure statute, and it states if you're working on behalf of or the interests of a foreign government in the US government's eyes, you need to register with the Department of Justice and periodically disclose your activities, file reports on your activities, and disclose any finances that may be involved. And if you don't, you're subject to prosecution. Now, the problem with FARA is that if you read the statute itself, it's written in such a vague, sweeping manner that it lends itself to really broad interpretation. And so it's very easily weaponized politically by the US government, and it has been. It's written so broadly that technically any foreign NGO or foreign business or foreign media outlet would qualify as a foreign agent under FARA. And FARA is incredibly broad in scope, but also selectively enforced according to the political whims and political interests of the US government. It's a piece of legislation that should not even exist. Who does and doesn't count as a foreign agent is entirely political. For example, Chinese and Russian media outlets like RT and CGTN have been forced to register under FARA. But BBC and The Guardian have not, because the latter two pretty much toe Washington consensus. Another example, AIPAC is one of the biggest and most powerful lobbying groups in the US. Its primary purpose is to make sure that members of Congress and other politicians promote the interests of Israel. It's not required to register under FARA, nor has it ever been ordered by the Department of Justice to register under FARA. Another example is that like think tanks like the Atlantic Council, the Middle East Institute, the Center for New American Security, these think tanks get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from the UAE. And this is well documented. And in exchange for that, these think tanks write policy reports lobbying on behalf of the UAE government, which then translates to US policy in favor of that government. These think tanks have never been required to register under FARA. So FARA was created in 1938 and it was first used to prosecute those spreading Nazi propaganda. But after World War II, enforcement began to decline. But when it was invoked, the DOJ used it to go after people who spoke out against US foreign policy broadly. Notably, W.E.B. Du Bois was indicted under FARA in 1951 for petitioning against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And they went after him using FARA, saying that he was promoting the interests of the Soviet Union and trying to say that he was a Soviet agent. In the last 40 years, FARA has been weaponized against anti-war and progressive organizations such as the Palestine Information Office, the Irish Northern Aid Committee, and the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. So this once obscure legislation is making a comeback and now being enforced with increasing regularity by the DOJ to go after anti-war organizations and progressive groups that are opposing this escalating war drive against China, as well as ordinary Chinese nationals and Chinese Americans living in the US. And it's being used as like a political tool and an intimidation tactic. For instance, nearly every media story you see now where some Chinese person is accused of espionage or being a foreign agent, it's almost always a case of FARA being used against them. FARA was what was used to go after dozens of Chinese academics under Trump's China initiative, where cases were brought against Chinese researchers for simply failing to disclose a foreign affiliation on a grant form. So they were trying to prosecute these like Chinese academics for simply failing, for like simply not filling out a grant form correctly. And if you actually look at the cases brought under FARA, the evidence is incredibly flimsy. Most of the cases of the brought against the Chinese academics, they ended up in dismissals, and the ones that didn't fell apart in court. And most of the researchers targeted accused FBI agents of misconduct during the investigations. So I think this is why Carlos's book is so crucial at this time. How do we even begin to confront this new Cold War if we can't even recognize that we are in one? Within the book, Carlos does a great job of drawing these parallels to the previous Cold War against the Soviet Union. And he also provides crucial context to some of the biggest myths surrounding China that are the results of these kinds of US media disinformation campaigns, like Xinjiang, and also, China's practice of so-called debt trap diplomacy. And in doing so, he unapologetically makes explicit who the real enemy is, which this era of McCarthyism tries so hard to obscure, which is the US. And as Carlos points out, much like the original Cold War, the new Cold War is a sustained conflict initiated and led by the US between the forces of imperialism, hegemony, and unipolarity on the one hand, and the forces of socialism, sovereignty, and multipolarity on the other.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.